Think in your mind where it is that God lives. What does it look like? Why does that place, that image we have, look a lot like the highest authority structure one could have imagined in the time it was coming out of? We don't imagine God randomly, nor do we happen to have all the same image. But those ideas came from the God of ancient times. We imagine God architecturally, politically, and symbolically, using the best metaphors we have available. So God sits on a throne. God sits high above, in a court, surrounded by lower beings and attendants of various kinds. This comes from even more ancient ideas coming from the imperial days of Persia, Mesopotamia, Egypt, etc. These emperors, like Yahweh, receive petitions and pleas for forgiveness. They dispense judgment. Some ideas of God are abstract and mysterious, but those are added later. This earlier imagery is imperial imagery. Why a throne? Why sitting at all? Why is he high above us? At the time, these were the highest power structures humans knew or could imagine. A king or emperor. A Persian king sits on a throne and behaves this way. So God becomes the ultimate monarch, the cosmic emperor, the final authority, seated at the top of reality. We project the largest power structure we know onto the universe and call it God. Is it possible? This is an idol? This image we put before the real thing. Let's talk about images. I feel like this is kind of like looking through a telescope on a tripod, looking at a Colorado mountain. You can learn a lot about Colorado by looking at it from that one specific single vantage point. You can see the shifts in ecosystem. You can see different plants and maybe animals sometimes. But to me, our understanding of God is like someone with that one perspective view of one mountain saying he's explaining and understands Colorado. We know that's not true, but more on that another time. Let's get back to prostration, bowing, and the body itself. Wow, what a transition. But notice how in worship still today, often we see that imagery. From the Bible, we use these mental images to describe and imagine God's dwelling place. In worship, we mentally or sometimes physically bow down. We kneel, we prostrate, hands sometimes lowered or sometimes raised, eyes sometimes downcast, but sometimes eyes wide open, confident, lifted high. These behaviors and feelings we get, they're left over from our feelings and expressions generations before us had. These aren't neutral gestures. This is how people would be behaving in an ancient court. How else are subjects going to behave before kings or emperors, rulers? It makes you wonder, why would the creator of the universe require the same body language as an ancient ruler? Why would his throne be in a courtroom? Why is he sitting on a throne at all? If today I saw someone sitting on a throne demanding my allegiance, I would think that was strange, maybe even narcissistic, if we're being honest. But that imagery back then would have been normal. These gestures train submission. They reinforce hierarchy. He's up there, I'm down here. He's on a throne surrounded by lower hierarchical beings that do his biddings. God rules the cosmos. He rules through posture. It sounds like something someone would make up to explain a concept that's unknowable. God is imagined using the highest political symbols of the age. Let's look at some examples. Isaiah 6:1. I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. This again is not symbolic language. This is how they thought of Yahweh, who was one of the gods of that time. This is Near Eastern kingship imagery. Throne, attendance, court protocol. God resembles a Persian or Assyrian emperor. It's royal court imagery. At this time, God isn't some abstract force yet, like we see in Greek Neoplatonism. And a couple side points. Isaiah was said to have had a real visionary encounter with the Lord on a throne. Isaiah is given temporary access to the divine counsel. There's nothing that implies this was a dreamlike experience for him, or a metaphor of some kind. Isaiah says he went to the Lord's dwelling place. So do you believe God sits on an imperial throne? This is God's word. Maybe God has moved residences. I thought God doesn't change, but he does, as we'll continue to see. Another point would be that Isaiah wouldn't be thinking of this dwelling place of the Lord as his future residence when he dies. Some kind of waiting heaven for those who pass on like we do today. No, think of this visit more as a summoning to the king's court. In Isaiah's day, in this ancient Jewish tradition, before Israel's exile, when you die, you go to Sheol, which is just a silent, shadowy, non-rewarding underworld. Once Persia starts influencing during the post-exilic period, we start to see resurrection ideas emerge. By the Second Temple period of the 6th century BC and later, we see multiple heavens, angels, judgment, along with a dualistic good versus evil, much like Persian Zoroastrianism. It's not until Paul, who again was influenced by Greek thought and Hellenistic Judaism, do we see an introduction of living forever. But back to the throne room examples. Psalms 47. God reigns over the nations. God sits on his holy throne. Yahweh is a king above kings. In Psalm 103, the Lord has established his throne in the heavens, and his kingdom rules over all. 1 Kings 22:19, I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the hosts of heaven standing beside him, on his right hand and on his left. If any part of it is symbolic, then you have to ask which part. Does he not have all those hosts of heaven that stand beside him? You can't just say it's symbolic. It's not. These are real imaginations of those writing these texts. And it mirrors Canaanite and Mesopotamian divine councils. Yahweh presides. He is not alone. Yahweh has a right side and a left side. This abstract idea of God doesn't emerge until the Persian period, 6th and 5th centuries BC, collecting, editing to match a more capable, authoritative concept. To bridge the gap between a walking God and an abstract one, Persian-era editors popularized the concept of the kavod, which is this divine glory. Instead of God himself sitting in the tabernacle, it was his glory or name that resided there. This allowed God to remain transcendent in the heavens while maintaining a presence on earth. The shift from an anthropomorphic God who walks, talks, and sits to an abstract, transcendent concept was driven by internal theological developments. It was influenced by external philosophical influences and linguistic changes over centuries. These changes in beliefs were edited into the script as things went, particularly in the Persian era, and heavily later in the Hellenistic era, starting in the 4th century BC. This era leading up to the Common Era saw further collecting, writing, and editing now being bombarded by the influence of ideas like Neoplatonism and Stoicism. Contact with Greek culture, or this Hellenization, after 330 BCE, significantly accelerated the abstraction of God. Let's look at Platonic and Aristotelian ideas. Greek philosophy viewed the first cause, or the divine, as unchanging, immaterial, and ineffable. Jewish thinkers like Philo of Alexandria, for example, used allegorical interpretation to reconcile the physical descriptions in the Torah with these philosophical ideals they were being faced with. In the 3rd century BCE, the demand for a Greek Old Testament yielded what we know as the Septuagint. This was a Greek translation. Now, translators of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, they often replaced anthropomorphic terms with more abstract language to better suit a Hellenistic audience accustomed to a transcendent deity. Anthropomorphic terms are those terms like, he looked on me, he walked in the garden, he asked questions. These are concepts we assign to humans. Anthropomorphic. These are the original ideas of Yahweh. This imagery again comes from royal courts, empires, and temples. It then evolves as human political imagination evolves and culture's influence. And it reflects how humans understood ultimate authority. God is imagined as a king when kings ruled. He's imagined as an emperor when empires dominated. He's imagined as a judge when law codes mattered. These are all human developments assigned to God. God always lives in the most impressive building humans can imagine, and he sits on the best chairs that they know of. Let's continue the conversation from last episode as we discuss God as a physical, limited being, as things were in early biblical theology. Genesis 3, God walks, he asks, he searches. Genesis 18, God eats with Abraham. In Genesis 11, God fears human unity. In Genesis 6, God regrets. These are not metaphors in the text. This is not symbolic language, no matter what an apologist will tell you. This is how the writers meant it. This is the Yahweh God that they knew. These are narrative descriptions, not metaphors. People have to remember, early Israelite religion was not monotheistic, as later defined. Yahweh appears among other gods. Think divine council imagery. Absolute omniscience emerges later, influenced by Greek philosophy. The Bible doesn't reveal a finished God. It documents one being assembled. If God was always omniscient, why does that idea appear so late? Let's continue looking at Persian and Zoroastrian influence on Hebrew theology. Let's look at what changed, when it changed, and why God suddenly looks different. We're going to dive deeper into the history. Let's look at before the exile. At this time, Yahweh is a tribal, local God. Before the 6th century BCE, Hebrew concepts of God looked different. Yahweh was a tribal, local God. He was localized to the land, the temple, the people there, and in Jerusalem. God walks and speaks directly with humans. Yahweh is a God among other gods, and monotheism isn't even considered in early Jewish tradition. This God fights Israel's enemies like a warrior king. He shares divine space with other heavenly beings. See, the Hebrews were being influenced by other parallel cultures like Canaanites. It's a dense cultural web of Near Eastern civilizations. Yahweh shares traits with El. which is the Canaanite high god, aged, fatherly, throne-seated, divine counsels, like we see in Psalms 82. That mirrors Ugaritic texts. Early Israelites practiced henotheism. Yahweh is their God, but not the only one. Mesopotamian culture, like Sumerian and Babylonian culture, they influenced Hebrew thought. And Genesis 1 parallels that. In those stories, there's divine speech that yields creation. Divine speech turns chaos into order. There's the flood narrative parallels in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Mosaic Law, as we see in the Torah, echoes the Code of Hammurabi. The Egyptians in the Late Bronze Age, we see influences of cosmic order, which parallels Hebrew ideas of justice. Wisdom literature, like Proverbs, it mirrors other ideas already available. Egyptian beliefs had temple symbolism. Their sanctuaries had Holy of Holies. Again, this web of ancient belief didn't happen in a vacuum. God certainly wasn't writing his unique word to the Hebrew people in these early days. It was rubbing next to and developing alongside its neighbors. During this time, Yahweh has a territory. Israel has its patron deity, and other nations have their own gods. Loyalty matters more than belief. We see this echoed in those early books over and over. You shall have no other gods before me. God is powerful, but he's not abstract or universal or metaphysical. Just take a minute to think about how strange it is. Looking at all those cultures, how their gods walk and talk and think and behave in the world, we know they're not real. You can see the proclivity in humans to think on a magical plane. It's so human to act this way. All of our ancestors during this time had their own ways of interacting with these gods. Israel was no different. Not to mention again that these stories were then collected, heavily edited, and some written down for the first time in the scribal era of the Hellenistic period in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. Well, let's go to a major shift in Hebrew history, the Babylonian exile. In 586 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar II conquers Jerusalem. The city is destroyed. Solomon's temple burned. The intellectually elite and many of the priests were deported to Babylon. This exile crushed Israel at large. Yahweh rules the land. Now they don't have a king, a central place of worship, all destroyed, and the people dispersed. Identity was lost. There was now a profound theological crisis. For one, if Yahweh, the number one God that loves his people, just allowed their temple to be destroyed and land and way of life gone, well, what does that say about their God? How will they even worship or interact with God Yahweh at all if they don't have a temple? This was a huge blow. Just a few years later, Persia enters the scene. A generation later, in 539 BC, a new empire enters. A new theology. Cyrus the Great of Persia conquers Babylon. This is massive. Cyrus allows the exiled peoples to return home. He funds a temple rebuilding and presents himself as a divinely chosen ruler. He rules a vast and multi-ethnic empire. For the Hebrews, Persia isn't just political relief, it's a whole new exposure to ideology. They now live under Persian religious imagination, which is heavily shaped by Zoroastrianism. What is Zoroastrianism? In simple terms, Zoroastrianism, associated with Zoroaster, includes ideas that were not prominent in early Israelite religion, like one supreme high God, cosmic moral dualism, like truth versus lie and good versus evil, and dark versus light. Ideas like an adversarial figure, like Satan or something. They get introduced to things like judgment after death. They get introduced to things like resurrection. Zoroastrian ideas of resurrection influenced Jewish developments of resurrection. They get introduced to ideas like heaven and hell, angels and messengers and spiritual hierarchy. History moving forward toward a final reckoning, a final judgment where good wins against evil. Does that sound familiar? These ideas explode into Jewish theology after the exile. After the exile, Judaism begins to say, God is no longer tied to land. God rules all nations. God sits above history. God governs morally, not just tribally. Evil becomes cosmic, not situational. Suffering is reframed as part of a divine plan. Now, these are all incredible developments, and maybe they are getting closer to truth. But what does it say about them before that? Were they worshiping God at all? If they thought God was tied to land and only ruled their nation and was tied to history unfolding and God governing tribally, what does that say about Yahweh then? And at what point does God say, you got me now. Yep, you're describing me now, so now I'm being worshipped. The whole thing kind of collapses when you see the human development. But at this time, this is where Satan becomes a more developed figure. Angels become named and ranked. Heaven becomes structured. Judgment becomes future-oriented. God now looks less like a regional warrior and more like a cosmic emperor. So why does God get a throne? Persia was an imperial bureaucracy. A king ruled from a throne. Authority was centralized. Law, judgment, and order flowed downward. Subjects approached the king through intermediaries. So naturally, God becomes enthroned. He's attended by heavenly courts. He's approached through priests and angels or law, and he's the ultimate judge of all peoples. This isn't coincidence. As human power becomes imperial, God becomes imperial. Now there's a Hebrew genius to this. It's reframing, not inventing. The Hebrews didn't simply copy Persian religion. They reinterpreted it through their own story. They absorbed ideas selectively and reframed them around Yahweh. This is why Yahweh replaces the Zoroastrian God, and Satan becomes subordinate, not equal. Monotheism now is hardening. God is becoming morally absolute. They took the best conceptual tools available to explain suffering, exile, injustice, and hope, and they built theology with those tools. And the result? A God who can survive defeat. A tribal God loses when the tribe loses. A cosmic God cannot lose. After exile, the people dispersed for over a generation. They needed a way to explain and make sense of the fact their God had no temple now. God's people were scattered. Well, God can now rule with a temple. He can act through foreign kings. He can punish his own people and can govern history itself. This makes Judaism portable, resilient, and future-facing. Leading to the 1st century CE, Christianity inherits this God, not the earlier one, a Greek and Persian-influenced concept of God. This moment explains why God suddenly becomes transcendent, why heaven becomes hierarchical, why judgment becomes central, and why God looks increasingly like an emperor, why theology tracks political structure. I want to be clear. My point isn't to say God is fake. I'm trying to show that God develops as human imagination, power, and trauma develop. When Israel loses everything, like land, king, temple, God doesn't disappear, he expands. He moves off the battlefield and onto a throne above history itself. And that move happens in the shadow of the Persian Empire. Heaven always suspiciously transforms the finest palace in the most advanced city with the cleanest version of society, replaced with thrones, gates, courts, armies, crowns. A medieval heaven has cathedrals, choirs, hierarchy, order. And today's evangelical heaven has endless worship service, emotional fulfillment, personal validation. Here, God loves emotionally. Why doesn't heaven ever look unfamiliar? Because heaven is not discovered. It's designed using the best aesthetics of the time. God always seems to know how power works, right after we invent it. If God always occupies the highest seat we can imagine, what happens when our imagination changes? Is God revealing himself through culture? Or are we revealing ourselves through God? Maybe God isn't an object sitting somewhere at all. Maybe God is the name we give to whatever feels larger than us, depending on the age we live in. It seems that God in his ways always looks like the people describing him. So, what does that say about where God comes from? Are we moving closer to God? Who knows? Is God reaching down to us? Are we uniting with God through right belief? As I said before, if there is a thinking, acting, observing God, maybe he's just really not impressed with anything we've done or come up with. Maybe he's confused by our behavior. If we pull back far enough, beyond doctrines, denominations, and arguments, we begin to see a pattern that runs through all of human history. Before temples and scriptures, humans gathered around fires. We danced. We sang. We painted animals on cave walls, images to behold. We told stories about spirits in the sky and forces in the earth. We did this not because we understood the world, but because we didn't. Fire kept us alive. The dark threatened us. So we ritualized fear and hope, turning chaos into something we could speak to, sing to, and maybe influence or be blessed by. Those early gods were close and volatile, just like nature itself was. They lived in storms, animals, and seasons. When things went wrong, they were angry. When things went well, they were pleased. Worship was physical, movement, rhythm, sacrifice, bodies expressing dependence before powers larger than themselves. As societies grew more complex, so did their gods. When tribes became nations, gods took on borders and preferences. They favored our people and opposed our enemies. Among the ancient Israelites, God became a national identity, chosen, set apart, ethnocentric, meaning focused on us. This wasn't unique. Every culture did the same thing in their own way. What made Yahweh different wasn't the pattern, but the survival of the story. Across cultures, we see the same behaviors repeated: animal sacrifices, blood rituals, offerings meant to appease divine anger or secure divine favor. The logic was consistent. Life could be traded for life, blood for blessing. The gods wanted what cost us something. If you could wake up afresh with no preconceived notions, and someone told you that God used to like animal sacrifices, and then later that God sent a son to also be sacrificed and his blood poured out for the forgiveness of sins and the satisfaction of his wrath, we would surely think that sounded silly. But because it's ingrained into our human history, into our ancestors, generations back, generation after generation after generation, all felt this way, no wonder it strangely makes sense to us. As empires rose, gods became more abstract and institutional. They ruled from thrones instead of forests. They issued laws instead of omens. With writing, God became textual. With philosophy, God became omnipotent. With empire, God became universal. Orthodoxy formed. Creeds hardened. Belief became regulated. Instead of abandoning sacrifice, Christianity centralized it. One sacrifice for all time. The structure remained, but the system became more efficient. God no longer needed endless blood. He needed belief, obedience, and allegiance. As cultures changed, God changed with them. As violence became less acceptable, hell often softened or wasn't talked about anymore. As empathy expanded, God became love, in the sense that we imagine it today. And in modern evangelical America, worship became emotional and immersive. Music, lights, and carefully timed moments designed to make God felt. A service is successful when patrons feel God, sense His moving. Creeds are respected with a 3-point modern psychological twist like you've never heard it before. But the behavior hasn't changed. We still gather, we still sing, we still ritualize fear and hope. We all create our spiritual patterns of behavior, and we develop them over time to where they feel normal and natural, and obviously true. What has changed is our technology and innovation, and with it, a bigger, better imagination of God. Again, at what point does God say, "Oh, you got me now. Now you understand me. Now you're actually worshiping me"? In prehistoric times, like the Stone-Aged gods, they wanted survival. In ancient times, agrarian gods wanted harvests and obedience. In the medieval times and Dark Ages, the imperial gods wanted loyalty and order. And in modern times, modern gods want authenticity, affirmation, and emotional connection. You can follow Maslow's hierarchy of needs right through that historical development of God. Quickly, if you're unfamiliar, Maslow was a mid-20th century psychologist who observed that people start with primitive needs like survival, food, water, shelter. That's the first hierarchy of needs. Then once that's established, we have safety needs like security, health, protection from harm. Then we can think about and have room for things like love and belonging. For God so loved the world. We want belonging to a community or group. We want intimacy. We can't think about these types of needs, for example, if we have no food or water. And then comes esteem needs like confidence, recognition, self-esteem. Here comes the established, confident church. Lastly comes needs of self-actualization. It's the highest level, and it represents reaching one's full potential. It's beyond behaving out of a deficiency, for example, and it's more focusing on growth. The modern evangelical church is powerful, thriving, confident, competent, full of love, acceptance for those in the group. Worship is highly emotional. It's It's beautiful. We always move from more primitive, simple ideas to more complex ones. Previous times saw God walking and talking and changing his mind, asking questions. Then he's sitting on a throne. His dwelling place was filled with sparkles, jewels, gold, and majestical imagery. Today's Christian God apparently likes fog, proper mood lighting. Isn't it interesting how that developed over time with human change and innovation? Technology shapes culture, and culture shapes God. A tribal people imagine a tribal God. Illiterate people imagine a speaking God. A bureaucratic society imagines a judging God. A therapeutic culture imagines a loving God who wants you to feel whole. The innovation continues. God evolves not because he reveals more, but because we do. Reality is, we are still stuck here with no signs of understanding the unknowable. All that's changed is us. In some ways, our tendencies and habits remain the same. In other ways, like human intellect and innovation, we've changed tremendously. It makes you wonder, which God is the right one? What image should I put in my mind so I know I'm worshiping the right one? The one on a throne? The one who sits and walks and talks with his people? Maybe I shouldn't focus on that. Maybe just his attributes. Which attributes? We have all kinds of personalities represented as God. He apparently cares that I hold the right belief. Now we have a third addition to the story that Jews completely reject. The very people that brought us some version of God completely reject the new addition in Jesus Christ. The people that God was apparently revealing himself to, where all the other civilizations and groups of people were wrong about their parallel stories, the right God actually comes down like a Greek deity and merges all the great ideas of God into one. Well, which Jesus do I believe in? Paul's Jesus? The Gospel's Jesus? Revelation's Jesus? More on that in future episodes. But when we trace that pattern honestly, it becomes difficult to escape the conclusion. God, or at least our concept of him, looks like us because he comes from us. He wants what our culture values. He changes when we change. We are not standing still while God moves through history. We're the ones moving through time, through culture, through exposure to other cultures and ideas, and through human innovation. And God moves with us. We are carrying him forward, reshaping him as we go. If God has always reflected the people who believe in him, what does that say about who we've really been worshiping?